Sahai, the managing editor of War on the Rocks. You are listening to Horns of a Dilemma. This episode features Sam Kleiner, author of The Flying Tigers, the untold story of the American pilots who waged a secret war against Japan. Sam spoke at the Clements Center at the University of Texas about a group of American pilots tasked with a covert operation in 1941 who soon found themselves taking on the Japanese in the Pacific Theater.
Thank you to everyone for coming out today, and it's such an honor to be here. When I was in high school in Tucson, I actually came to UT for a debate camp when I was 14, so it has a special place in my heart. Unfortunately, I was looking over my notes from the book last night, and I was hoping that there was an alumni of the University of Austin, Texas, who served in the Flying Tigers, and there's a bunch of guys from Texas, but they all seem to have gone to Texas A&M or some one of the aeronautical schools. So I did not luck out with a great personal connection to UT, but it's such a wonderful story and such a privilege to be able to share it with you. So I thought I'd start by just reading from the beginning of the book, which I think kind of gives the vantage point of how I wanted to set up the story of the Flying Tigers. And then my goal today, I imagine there's a wide array of level of expertise and interest in the Flying Tigers. I saw one gentleman who has a couple books on Chenault sitting in the back there, so I think that your degree of expertise might be higher than others, particularly for my generation who might not have heard of the Flying Tigers before. And so I want to walk through a bit of the history of of the China-Burma-India theater, the CBI theater, and then kind of what drew me to telling this story and the way in which, as Will mentioned, I did have an academic background, but was trying to write something here that was more for public consumption, and I really enjoy talking about the dialogue between academic research and writing for a more public audience, and happy to talk about that. So we'll start, as most World War II books start, on December 7, 1941. The freezing temperatures in New York City on December 7, 1941 didn't stop more than 55,000 football fans from packing the stands at the Polo Grounds in Upper Manhattan. This was the highly anticipated crosstown rivalry game between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. After the underdog Dodgers took a 7-0 lead, they kicked the ball down the field, and listeners at home heard the announcer on WR radio call the play. "It's a long one, down to around the 3-yard line," he said, and the Giants' Ward Cuff made the catch and started to run it down the field. Over the cheers of the crowd, the announcer continued, "Cuff's still going. He's up to the 25, now he's hit hard about the 27-yard line. Bruce Kinnard made the tack." Suddenly, the reporting of the game was cut off as another voice broke in. "We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Stay tuned to WOR for further developments, which will be broadcast immediately as received." Inside the stadium, the game went on without any kind of announcement. The crowd watched as the Brooklyn Dodgers clinched an upset 21-7 victory. The sun was setting as the fans headed for the exits. Then the public address system came on. All Navy men in the audience are ordered to report to their posts immediately. All Army men are to report to their posts tomorrow morning. This is important. There was a sudden, startled buzz in the crowd, the sports writer for the Brooklyn Eagle reported. What had happened, no one knew, not until he got close to the nearest radio or within hearing range of newsboys yelling in the streets. The Navy Department censors delayed the releasing of photographs of the destruction in Hawaii, but on December 20th, Time magazine featured them in its coverage of the havoc in Honolulu. One image showed large clouds of black smoke rising from the wreckage of the USS Arizona, and another a P-40 plane that had been wrecked on the field and never fought. A hangar at the Army's Hickam Field had also been destroyed. This was the carnage from Japan's sneak attack. Time carried a dire headline in that December 29th issue. Invasion of the U.S.? It reported that anti-aircraft guns were deployed in New York City to defend power plants, anti-aircraft factories, docks, and shipyards against the threat of a Luftwaffe attack. The fear was more pronounced in the West. Quote, "At forest fires, lookout towers in little tar-taped covered shacks scattered on the hills along the coast. Spotters watch the gray skies 24 hours a day in 3-hour shifts," end quote. San Francisco was blacked out, and reporter Ernie Piles said that its darkened streets looked like the dusty remnants of a city dead and uninhabited for 100 years. But that edition of Time included another story, one that would capture the imagination and raise the hopes of Americans in the dark days after Pearl Harbor. In China, a unit of U.S. volunteers was battling the Imperial Japanese Air Force, whose planes had been bombing Chinese cities and killing thousands of civilians for the past 4 years. They were known as the Flying Tigers, and Time reported their exploits in stirring fashion. Last week, 10 Japanese bombers came winging their carefree way up into China, heading directly for Kunming. The Flying Tigers swooped, let the Japanese have it. Of the 10 bombers, said Chinese reports, 4 plummeted to the earth in flames. The rest turned tail and fled. Tiger casualties, none. Members of the Tigers would soon become familiar figures. Their leader, Colonel Claire L. Chennault, and pilots like David Tex Hill and Scarsdale Jack Newkirk. Years before American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy or raised the flag on Iwo Jima, it was Chennault's Flying Tigers who rallied the country with victories when the Axis forces appeared unstoppable. 100 American volunteers had taken the measure of the enemy, Claire Booth wrote in Life. Who, in the face of that measure, dared doubt that America could, if it would, defeat Japan? The Flying Tigers' shark-nosed P-40s, also known as Tomahawks, would go down in history as one of the iconic images from World War II. Hollywood executives knew a heroic story when they saw one, and in 1942, Republic Pictures rushed out Flying Tigers starring John Wayne as the swashbuckling commander of the unit. Hollywood produced its own adventures, but the truth was that the pilots were doing deeds that a movie director would reject in a script as too fantastic, as Time described them in April 1942. Despite the hyperbole, the Flying Tigers were indeed undertaking an important mission. They helped to keep China in the war, and if China fell, Japan would be able to focus its forces against an unprepared and underarmed United States. It would take 5 decades for the Pentagon to acknowledge the truth about the Flying Tigers, namely that the mission was a covert operation authorized at the highest levels of the Roosevelt White House in violation of America's neutrality and out of view of an isolationist Congress months before Pearl Harbor. Its pilots and ground crew resigned from the U.S. military, bade their loved ones farewell, and crossed the Pacific on ocean liners carrying passports listing false professions to disguise the truth about their mission. Over 100 pilots arrived at a makeshift camp in the jungles of Burma to discover planes that they didn't know how to fly. Determined and desperate, they drilled the new tactics to fight the Japanese Air Force more agile planes, and were just about to enter the battle when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. When President Roosevelt declared war, they were practically behind enemy lines, outnumbered, and with no reinforcements coming. Yet between December 20, 1941 and July 4, 1942, they shot down scores of Japanese planes in Burma and southern China. And for over 75 years, the most detailed accounts of the Flying Tigers lay buried in pilots' diaries and in letters that were hidden away in closets and at the back of drawers after the war, and in combat reports that lay moldering in the basement of an unremarkable brick building in Georgetown. Their achievements are even more remarkable and stirring than the myth created by Hollywood. The story of the Flying Tigers begins with a boy growing up in rural Louisiana with dreams of seeing the world. So that's kind of the opening frame of the book. And what I wanted to do with that was to capture what it felt like to be an American in December 1941, experiencing the shock of the attack on Pearl Harbor in kind of real time. And the Flying Tigers emerge as an important story for Americans in those very desperate days. And when we look back on World War II, it's obviously a story of victory. But in those early weeks, months, and even years of World War II, the war felt deeply unwinnable. America had sunk to having the 15th largest military in the world, right behind Portugal by the time Pearl Harbor happened. We suddenly found ourselves in a two-front war, facing a massive surprise attack that destroyed large parts of the Pacific Fleet. And Nazi Germany had already been on the march across Europe for years. Japan had already been in war in China since 1937. And the sense that Americans had was that this was going to be a war that could not be won, and if it was to be won, would take many years. And so the Flying Tigers emerged publicly as this very important narrative at the very beginning of the war, just a couple weeks after Pearl Harbor, even before the Doolittle raid that doesn't come until the middle of 1942. It was the Flying Tigers and Claire Chennault and the many pilots who I spoke about, David Tex Hill, who's from the Austin area, Scarsdale Jack Newkirk, who became front page celebrities at a time when Americans needed to believe in the possibility of victory. And their record, and the actual record we can talk more about, is very controversial, of how many planes they shot down. And if any of your families were in the Flying Tigers, people get very sensitive about this topic. But whatever that actual number was, the fact that they were scoring victories against the Japanese really helped to inspire Americans that this war could be won. So that at a public level is why this story was so important and quickly became embedded in the psychology of how Americans thought about the war. The shark-faced image of the P-40, made famous also through the John Wayne movie that came out in 1942 called The Flying Tigers, quickly became a symbol of American perseverance, strength, and the possibility of victory at a time when that was greatly needed. I originally came to this topic, though not through that lens. My grandfather served in the war, was a navigator on a B-25, and I'd gone to aviation museums with him growing up, and I had seen this plane and had heard a bit about this, so I was familiar with the story. But I actually came across this story in a more in-depth way when I was at Oxford, and I was writing my dissertation about how America goes to war, and particularly on the legal aspects of it. And I was writing a lot about Roosevelt's foreign policy in that period, and there's a great deal of ink that's been spilled about Roosevelt's approach to Nazi Germany, and that's what I was really writing about, was how Roosevelt was undertaking great amount of risk in trying to assist Great Britain at a time when that was in violation of the Neutrality Acts, taking steps like sending the Destroyers for Bases deal, sending 50 destroyers over to Great Britain, pushing for the Lend-Lease Act, and taking other very aggressive steps like sending troops to Iceland and really pushing against the isolationists who were dominating Congress. And what I also found as I was doing that was that there was a parallel and much lesser known story about America's foreign policy in Asia, which was much less well known. That going back as far as 1937, the Roosevelt administration was becoming deeply concerned about Japanese militarism, and there was an internal debate going on within the White House about how to respond to that. And so leading the charge as kind of an anti-Japanese or someone who was very concerned about Japanese militarism was the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau. And Morgenthau had a great affinity for China. He was Jewish and was concerned about the atrocities that were happening in China, going as far back as 1937, with the rape of Nanking being one of those, but the decimation that was happening across China as the Japanese invaded, and the aerial bombardment of cities like Chongqing that was raining a huge amount of death in China, and pushed Roosevelt to give a speech that was called the Quarantine Speech that Roosevelt delivered in Chicago in 1937, talking about how we're going to have a quarantine on aggressors. And really that was directed at Japan. But there was a huge amount of public backlash to that. And Roosevelt quickly realized that he was leading in front, but he talked about when he looked behind him, no one was there following him. And he understood that at least publicly, he wasn't going to be able to wage a successful public campaign that would push America closer to war. And Roosevelt was very much constrained by a public that was war-weary, that was concerned about the idea of getting involved in another foreign war and the memory of World War I, and still hung over the administration. And in the 1940 campaign, he had to run on a pledge of keeping America out of war. He talked a lot about how he had sons who were serving in the military and he wouldn't want them getting involved in a war. But on the side, he was able to take steps that were highly secret, that were taking that were aimed to help the Allies. And so one of these schemes became the genesis of the Flying Tigers. But to understand that scheme, you have to understand a very different man than FDR, and that man is Claire Lee Chennault. And Claire Chennault is a pilot from the Army Air Corps from Louisiana, originally born in Commerce, Texas, who at one point was one of the more famous pilots in the Army Air Corps, kind of a predecessor to the Blue Angels. He was a pilot with a group called the Flying Trapeze that in the 1930s would fly around the country putting on aviation shows. He had first seen an airplane at a country fair in Louisiana and decided that he wanted to be a pilot, had a long struggle to become a pilot, and then reached that pinnacle of his career, only to find that his views on the future of air warfare were really being stymied within the Army Air Corps. This was a period where there were great debates within the Army Air Corps about whether the bomber or the fighter would win out as kind of the main tool of air power. And most people believed what was called the Douthit theory, that the bomber would always get through and that the bomber was going to become the centerpiece of how air war was being conducted, and the Army Air Corps, of course, had some self-interest in that, because that then meant that, if the bomber could get through, then you should be funding us more, and if the fighter could stop the bomber, that kind of jeopardized the entire enterprise of having such a large Army Air Corps. And there was a great deal of skepticism within the military about the utility of the aircraft, because they hadn't really been fully tested in World War I. It was a war that was fought mostly on the ground. And Chennault became a leading advocate of investing in fighters, and was publishing articles that were not well regarded by his peers about the utility of using fighters in the kind of tactics that he was experimenting with his group called the Flying Trapeze. And by 1937, Chennault, who was married and had 7 children, found himself kind of with his career tailing off. And at one air show he was at in Miami, he was approached by a gentleman, this was in 1935, from the Chinese Air Force, who said, we were very impressed with your flying. Would you like to come advise our nascent Air Force? And this is Chiang Kai-shek's regime. And that sounds like a very preposterous thing from our current standpoint, but in that day and age, that was actually quite common. You had a huge amount of Army aviators who were being hired to go abroad, some in Latin America, some who were already in China, and were advising them on developing, really helping to build an Air Force. And that was very appealing, but he said, I've got these 7 children, I've got a wife, and I have, this career in the Army. But by 1937, it was pretty clear that his Army tenure was coming to an end, and he was going to get pushed out, as he referred to it in his memoirs. He was going to end up flying a desk. So he decided that he was going to completely change his life, and he wrote in a letter to his brother that this new job in China might not amount to anything, or it might be the kind of thing that's remembered in history for hundreds of years to come. And he goes over to China in 1937, arrives in June of 1937, about a couple weeks before the commencement of a new round of combat between the Japanese and the Chinese, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And he writes in his diary after that, there's a lot of pressure for the American pilots to leave, coming from the State Department. They were very concerned that if you have American pilots who are there, this is going to cause an international incident, and this is very dangerous and fraught territory for American pilots to be. And so it was told by the Consul General that you're not going to be able to come home again if you stay. And it's remarkable to think of a man who has barely been in China, but he decides that he's going to stay, and he writes in his diary, "I guess I'm Chinese now." And so he stays over the next couple years, and from 1937 to 1941 becomes an integral advisor to Madame Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Kai-shek. And you could do a whole separate talk about them, but Madame Chiang was essentially Americanized. She had her family had deep ties to the United States. She had grown up largely in the U.S., had gone to Wellesley. Her brother had gone to Harvard and was TV Song was helping to run the finances of the country. And there was kind of this debate within China over who should we be allied with. And so in that period, you have Italian aviators who are running a large part of the Chinese Air Force. You have Nazi advisors led by a military figure named von Falkhausen. My German's not good. And you had Soviet advisors also. So it was this kind of fascinating interplay of the geopolitics of the era. And as the fighting commenced, Chennault formed what became known as the International Squadron. So you had guys who were showing up. Some had claimed that they had fought in the Spanish, had been fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Some were showing up from all over different parts of the Far East who were pilots. And they had this kind of motley crew of pilots who were trying to help as the Chinese were retreating, and there were a series of defeats basically until they were forced into this small corner in the south in Chongqing and Kunming. And this unit was, it's just fascinating to get to write about. And I can talk more about the methodology of getting access to this stuff, but these are guys who are real adventurers, and these are real, there's a question of whether the Flying Tigers were mercenaries. These guys were definitely mercenaries. These are real One of the guys claims this is the 7th war he's been fighting in, and so it's just a fascinating period. And this is a couple of years before Pearl Harbor, and you already have Americans who are over there. And the Roosevelt administration's concerns did become well-founded. There's one guy, a pilot named Elwyn Gibbon, who's there with his wife, and he at a certain point decides, this has been enough after the loss at Hinko, and he says, I'm going to go back to the U.S. The ship he gets on to go back stops in Yokohama. The Japanese police come on board, and his name has already been published in the New York Times as one of the members of the international squadron. He's arrested, and for 2 weeks, the front page of the New York Times every day is the trial of Elwyn Gibbon and what was presumed to be the fact that he was going to be executed for killing Japanese soldiers. And they end up releasing him, and he comes home. But so there's a lot of controversy around this idea of having Americans over there, and the Roosevelt administration understood that there's a lot of sensitivity to this issue. But as China kept being beat back into this corner, they lost any connection to the outside world through the sea. And so they had to rely on the Burma Road, which went from Kunming into Rangoon in Burma, that then gave them access to an outside seaport. And the danger with that was that there was a concern that the Japanese were going to be attacking from the air, and that would then cut off China's ability to bring in goods and to bring in arms, and that would basically be the end of China's participation in the war. And much like the Roosevelt's policy towards Great Britain, the focus was how can we keep the Chinese in the war? So in 1940, right after the election, Claire Chennault is sent back to Washington, D.C., and this is after 3 years of already having been in China. And he recalls this meeting where he's called to meet with Madame Chiang and Chiang Kai-shek. He recalls they say, you must go to the United States immediately, work out the plans for whatever you think you need, do what you can to get American planes and pilots. He writes in his diary, ordered back to the U.S. for duty. And he boards the Chinese Clipper and flies back to San Francisco and then arrives in Washington on November 15th, 1940. So this is just weeks after Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented third term, and Roosevelt is feeling increasingly liberated now to take bolder risks in his foreign policy. And the term the China lobby later took on more sinister connotations, but it was a real thing. And so Chennault arrives in Washington, D.C., and he goes to report to T.V. Soong, who's the brother of Madame Chiang. And T.V. Soong was known as the Morgan of China, as Time magazine described him. He was kind of a cosmopolitan, sophisticated guy that had a Harvard degree. And he fit in very well with the crowd that was populating the Roosevelt administration, people like Associate Justice Felix Frankfurter, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau. He became very well known for his elaborate dinners where he would serve Peking duck, and these kind of guys would come over and they would smoke cigars and hang out. And he formed a very close relationship with Morgenthau, was arranging for these huge loans to be sent over to the Chinese. And Chennault's role when he arrived in November of 1940 was to help organize, as he wrote in a memo, a special air unit. And the idea was to get American planes and American pilots who were secretly going to come over and help fight for the Chinese. And this is this did come into reality, but it's remarkable to think about because it's so crazy. The idea that America would risk confrontation with Japan, which had signed an alliance with Nazi Germany, to send American pilots all the way over to China is, it's preposterous. But Morgenthau loved this idea. He thought this was just brilliant. And Soong had a meeting with him where he presented the plans that Chennault had been working on. And Morgenthau thought, not only should we be sending American pilots and American fighters in a defensive posture, but why don't we actually send over bombers that could be used to destroy Japanese cities? And he talks in one of the memos about, the Japanese cities are made of wood, and if we can get incendiary bombs over there, we can destroy the Japanese before we ever have to get involved in the war. So this is like really crazy stuff. And eventually, some of the generals, including General Marshall, are able to talk them down. And there's a complicated diplomatic history that's going on because a lot of these planes were actually supposed to be sent to Great Britain, and they had to get the British sign off on it, and they had to get British sign off to actually put this unit in Burma. But over the course of about 6 months, between a lot of meetings, they were able to work out this plan. And there is archival proof that there was a meeting where Roosevelt signed off on this. So Roosevelt was aware of this, and Roosevelt's an eminently fascinating figure. He kind of he's very careful not to put his fingerprints on anything. There's always been this rumor that there was an executive order he signed to set up the Flying Tigers. That's just not true. Roosevelt was much too shrewd to be putting his name on a document that was clearly illegal, and this was clearly illegal under domestic law and a violation of the Neutrality Acts, and it's a clear violation of international law. America is a neutral power in this conflict between Japan and China, but that Roosevelt was not someone who was concerned too much with legality once he thought that something was an important investment. And so what ended up happening was that there was basically a front company that was set up that was called Camco that was in charge of the finances. There was a mechanism for funneling money from the American government into an intermediary that then paid for it. So they went and bought these planes that were up in Buffalo, New York. And then the fun part of the story, for me at least, was getting to read about how all these young pilots were basically recruited for this secret operation. And so you had guys who were, you would basically show up at a bar near an airbase, and these recruiters that were basically Chennault's old friends would go around and try and sign people up for this mysterious mission in the Far East. I'm going to do a survey, and I guess that everyone over the age of 40 is going to know who Pappy Boyington is, but I guess there's some people under that age who also know who he is. So Pappy Boyington's a very famous Marine Corps pilot from the war. He's in 1941. He's living down in Florida. His wife had just left him. He has a bunch of gambling debt. He's concerned about being pushed out of the Marine Corps. He's down in Pensacola where they train Marine aviators. On a Saturday night, he walks over to the San Carlos Hotel, which is the most popular bar in town because they have air conditioning. And he goes up to the bar, he orders a drink, and he starts talking to the guy next to him about all of his woes. And the guy says, "Your lucky day. There's a guy upstairs recruiting pilots to go fly in the Far East, and you can make a lot of money doing it." And so he finishes his drink and goes upstairs, and the guy starts talking about you're going to make all this money. It's going to be really easy shooting. You're just going to be flying and fighting against Japanese transports. And he says, I was pretty suspicious of this guy's pitch, but you could have pitched me on just about anything from where I was. And that was a lot of the kind of guys they ended up signing up. There's only one survivor now of the unit, and a lot of what I did in researching this was spending time with the families to get access to diaries and letters and combat reports and photographs that no one had seen before. And so I spent a lot of time with the last surviving member of the unit, who was a mechanic by the name of Frank Lazansky, who was originally from Detroit, and he had been a mechanic in the Army working on P-40s. Someone came up to Lansing, Michigan, where he was stationed, and said, do you want to go to the Far East? And he had a girlfriend at the time, and he said, I'll go make some money. It'll be a chance for me to see some of the world, and then I'll come back and we'll get married. And these were supposed to be one-year contracts. So this is before Pearl Harbor. The idea that you're going to be over there for years is not really present for these guys. But these were children of the Great Depression, many of whom had, their families were really short on money. He had tried to make ends meet by going down to the railroad, he told me, and picking up pieces of coal that would fall off the train so they could heat their home. And for someone to be coming and pitching you a large amount of money to go to the other side of the world to actually get to see some combat was very intriguing for these guys in 1941. Before the war, and some of them even had an affinity for the Far East. David Tex was his nickname. Hill was a pilot who was from the Austin area, and his family had been missionaries in Korea early on, so he always kind of had this interest in the Far East. So they put together this unit of around 100 pilots, a couple hundred ground crew, just so many amazing stories that I don't have time to get into, but in researching it, it was just such a joy to find these guys' personal stories and these in the letters and diaries. When I was working on this and when I was at Yale, I came across a collection of love letters between a nurse in the unit and a pilot who had both joined and fallen in love and gotten married while they were in the unit. And I won't give away the end of their story, but just having those kind of personal connections and allowing you to experience that up close made a huge difference in being able to tell the story, as well as having combat reports the Chennault family had kept basically in the bottom of this basement in Washington, D.C. for 75 years. So they go over undercover. They're basically disguised under all different kinds of aliases in their passports, different professions. They set up in Burma, which is a British colony, in 1941. They're getting ready to enter the war, and Chennault is kind of this renegade commander. He has all these different theories for how air combat should be structured, the kind of diving that they should do, and this is his chance to kind of shape a unit in his own image, something that the Army Air Corps had denied him. And as they were getting ready to go into combat, they were already sending their advance units to Kunming to prepare their base. They get the news on the radio that that Pearl Harbor had been attacked on what was for them December 8th, 1941. And that immediately sprung them into action. There's a concern that they're going to be struck at their base in remote Burma and Tungo, and they quickly go up into Kunming. And it's remarkable for many reasons, but these guys have never seen combat before. These are young American pilots. They signed up, many of them thinking this was just going to be, kind of a lark or some kind of adventure. And many of them don't really seem sure of the fact that they're going to end up in combat. And, there's all of the public descriptions of them, they quickly become these heroes, but the diary accounts and the letters reveal how scared they were of going into combat. But they go up to Kunming, and as they land there, they can see the carnage from the destruction of a Japanese bombardment. And Kunming was one of these cities that had just been bombarded by the Japanese for 4 years at that point. And so for all of these guys, this was their first exposure to the horrors of warfare, and particularly of aerial warfare, because the Japanese attacks on Chinese cities were really the first time, you see this also in Spain with Guernica, of the use of the airplane as a weapon to target civilian populations, which was something that hadn't really been conceptualized before this. And so for years, basically, Kunming had been defenseless, and Chennault was eager to prove that his troops could defend Kunming, and that this would kind of prove his thesis that the fighter could be a powerful weapon in war. They spend December 19th waiting, no planes come, and then finally on December 20th, a large group of Japanese bombers come in, and as they're coming in, Chennault, they have a warning net of Chinese spotters who are throughout the countryside who telephone in the position of the Japanese planes. Chennault has this big map in his war room where he kind of tries to plot out their position, and he sends his men up into the sky. And from there, the radio signal breaks up, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. But on that day, the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, as they were known, took out 4 of the 10 Japanese bombers. And they come back and they land, and Chennault says, they report back, and he said, that's good, but next time you really need to take out all of them. And that was always kind of his attitude with his men. And that story became the basis of that Time article I started with. That was the first victory of the Flying Tigers. And people always ask how they get that name, which is my least favorite question because it's the most complicated or the least certain. But there's different theories as to how they became known as the Flying Tigers, which is actually very discongruous with the image of the plane, which is a shark face. And that was actually picked up from a magazine they saw where they saw some an Australian plane with that decoration. There were also German planes at that time with the same nose art. And for Chennault, they were always known as the American Volunteer Group, and actually the first American Volunteer Group, because there were plans to send over more of them, which never materialized. But the name the Flying Tigers, which was in that Time article from December 1941, really seems to have come out of a PR campaign back home that the reporter said, we're not, we can't call these guys the American Volunteer Group. And part of this group back home, which included some really fascinating figures in Washington history, particularly Tommy the Court Corcoran, who was one of the main kind of behind the scenes guys for the Roosevelt administration, who was intimately involved in setting this up and would become a lifelong friend of Chennault, said, let's call these guys the Flying Tigers. And so that's what they would become known for. And the Flying Tigers would go on to have a fairly successful run fighting the Japanese through July of 1942. I'm going to kind of brush through the rest of this so we can go to questions, because I'd rather engage with people than to keep talking, which I could do for days about this. They have a very successful run through July of 1942. There's a lot of tensions between Chennault and Stilwell, who comes to command American forces in the Far East. And there's a sense of, this had a utility when we were secretly involved in this war, but now that we're openly here, Stilwell didn't want this renegade guy running around with a bunch of Americans who were technically under Chinese command. And he was short on planes. And so he said, I'm going to turn you guys basically into my reconnaissance unit. And so they were flying these very low-flying missions in Burma over Japanese positions. More and more of the Americans were being killed. There's almost basically a revolt against Chennault in the unit. This is the kind of stuff that doesn't make it into the John Wayne movie. And in July of 1942, as the unit is merged into what becomes the China Air Task Force, later the 14th Air Force, most of these guys decide they're going to go home, and they end up flying in all different parts of World War II. Pappy Boyington goes on to become the famous Marine pilot from the Far East. James Howard goes on to win a Medal of Honor for flying against the Nazis in an incredible raid. And Chennault stays the entire war in China. His big obsession is, we need to use China as a base to attack the Japanese home islands. And that is really defeated in 1944 as they get further and further back east, building more air bases. The Japanese offensive in 1944, called the Ichigo Campaign, destroys all those forward air bases, which was always Stilwell's concern, that you couldn't defend your own bases without enough ground troops. And so Chennault's plan basically collapsed. He's basically pushed out of the army before the end of the war. To his great pain, he was not invited to the surrender ceremony on the Missouri. He's already home by that point. And he gets home to his wife in waterproof Louisiana in 1945 after basically having been gone for 8 years. And as one of the articles said, that was no longer his home. His real home was in China. And so he picked up, he got divorced, returned to China, marries a young woman, Anna Chen, who becomes famous as Anna Chennault, and that's a whole other story of her career and legacy. But he goes back to China, and after World War II becomes an aide to Chiang Kai-shek, and almost as kind of a reprise of the Flying Tigers, he starts a company called CAT, Civil Air Transport, buying up old Army transports that are left over from World War II. And CAT goes on to start doing operations for the Chinese, particularly the evacuation to Formosa, or present-day Taiwan, that takes place in the end of the 1940s. And then they need to start drumming up new business. This is the beginning of commercial of cargo planes. And so there's another group of the guys who start Flying Tigers line domestically, which later becomes part of FedEx. And CAT, to drum up new business, comes back, and Chennault has some meetings with some folks from a new agency in Washington called the Central Intelligence Agency, and they decided that they would buy CAT secretly as part of their own airline. And so in the 1950s, you'll find CAT airplanes basically doing the work of the U.S. government, particularly during the Eisenhower administration, that couldn't be done publicly, but that they wanted to be done. So the Dulles brothers didn't want American forces, or Eisenhower really put down his foot and said, we can't have American forces rescuing the French at Dien Bien Phu. But you have CAT Airlines flying in supplies. So the first Americans who were killed in the war in Vietnam are CAT airline pilots who are flying in supplies to Dien Bien Phu, and their names are not on the wall in Washington because that is not actually an official part of the war, but they're flying American supplies under American orders. And so you see this this is really the genesis of, and one of the larger takeaways from the book is that this is really the genesis of the idea of using corporations as kind of a front for American foreign policy in ways that allow American policymakers to diminish their fingerprints on a particularly murky situation by having contractors do it for them. And there was a joke from one of the leaders in the Eisenhower administration when the British would say, is this something you guys are doing in the Far East? And they always liked having Chennault there because it was always something they could say, oh, no, that's just cat, and that it always gave them some plausible deniability for CIA operations. Chennault ended up retiring between Louisiana and Taiwan, spending the rest of his life kind of going back and forth, and much to his chagrin, he never felt like this story got fully told. So over the years, there's been a lot of books written about the Flying Tigers, and what motivated me as I came across this story in 2015 was that there had never really been a book that captured the human history of this unit and then placed and through that would build out excitement about the CBI theater and getting to see these characters go through the war, getting exposure to a new part of the war, because I think when Americans think about World War II now, we think about D-Day or we think about the flag raising at Iwo Jima, but we don't think about China. And obviously, this is a different China today than we're talking about. The Chinese leaders I'm talking about lose the Chinese Civil War, but there is a relationship with Mao that Americans had during the war, which is a separate, fascinating story. And Chennault did work with a lot of guerrilla leaders in the Far East, including a young guerrilla leader from Vietnam who came to meet with him and had helped downed American airmen and asked for his autograph, and Chennault gave him a couple Colt 45s as a reward, and that was Ho Chi Minh. So history plays out in weird ways, and Ho Chi Minh revered Chennault because he saw himself as a guerrilla leader like Chennault had been portrayed, as someone who used a smaller force to fight against a larger force through very precise attacks. And Ho Chi Minh for years would present the Colts and the signed picture of Chennault as a sign that he had the imprimatur of the Americans to his side. And so you kind of start to see a continuity between these different eras in history also, which is what's so fascinating. But I wanted to bring back this idea that, of the important alliances during World War II, China was really much a part of that. And had China lost in those periods, you would have seen a massive commitment of Japanese forces to the island campaign where American troops were fighting, and so much, and keeping China in the war was such an important part of our strategy for the Far East. So as we think about China today, there is definitely some utility in remembering that we do have the shared history, and I do think that it informs Chinese views about themselves and their role in the world. There's been a lot of different meetings between Chinese leaders and American leaders where the topic of this cooperation has come up. There was a meeting a few years ago between then Secretary Clinton and her counterpart, where the Chinese official brought out a portrait of her father, who was a Chinese communist guerrilla with downed American airmen, and said, my father saved downed American airmen, and that was something that I grew up with. And so this story of the Flying Tigers is very much revered in China as a huge part of how they think about the war. There's a really bad new Bruce Willis movie that just came out about it in China. There's a lot of controversy around it, but so it's not something that we've done as good a job of keeping up here. So it's such an honor to be able to tell that story and to kind of hopefully rekindle it for a new generation. So with that, I'm happy to take questions of any sort.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.